You're listening to the FQXi podcast. Today, celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the Higgs Boson discovery, particle physicist Kevin Black tells us about the LHC's new goals ahead of starting its new run in July.
Charlie Glashow, he had this famous quote in which he said, "The Higgs boson is like your house's toilet. Everyone agrees it plays an extremely important function, but it doesn't feature highly on house tours."
Back from the future, Kevin Black also reminisces about a bizarre proposal a decade ago that a time-travelling Higgs was sabotaging the particle accelerator and shutting it down before it could ever start.
And there was a somewhat crazy paper, but from a very well-respected physicist, about how the production of the Higgs boson couldn't be seen because it would go back in time and stop itself from ever being produced by somehow stopping the accelerator.
Collapsing consciousness, Catalina Curceanu, on her underground quantum tests of a leading model of consciousness.
Initially, I thought, like, oh, come on. But when I've seen that Roger is one of the proponents, I started to read it more carefully. Then I realized that it's at least to my knowledge, maybe the only real physical theory about consciousness in which I can do something.
And building quantum clocks.
The child holds the watch up to their ear. No sound. No sound. And then, after an aching age, as if awaking from an ancient slumber, comes a sonorous, reverberant tick.
I'm Zeeya Merali. Welcome back to the podcast from the Foundational Questions Institute. July the 4th, 2022, marks the 10-year anniversary of the announcement from CERN about the discovery of the Higgs boson at the Large Hadron Collider near Geneva in Switzerland. A decade on, and the world's biggest particle accelerator is coming back from a well-earned 3-year break for maintenance and upgrading. The collider went back online in April this year and is now gearing up for Run 3, scheduled for the 5th of July, the day after the Higgs' 10th birthday party, as it were. So I called up Kevin Black, a particle physicist at the LHC and at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, to find out about the collider's latest quest, and for an update on the recent buzz in the particle physics community about some weird results about the mass of the W Boson that came out of Fermilab, an accelerator near Batavia, Illinois. But before getting into all that, I couldn't resist bringing up a fun piece that Black wrote for FQXi some years back, before the LHC initially started. That piece ended up breaking records and nearly melting our server because it was so popular. It sounds like science fiction, but it did actually come out of a genuine physics paper, and it was about how the LHC was being sabotaged from the future by a time-travelling Higgs boson that was journeying to the past to stop itself from ever being created. A particle physics grandfather paradox, you might say.
Yes, so there was at the time a lot of consternation about delays and the accident that occurred at the LHC during the startup. And there was a somewhat crazy paper, but from a very well-respected physicist, about how the production of the Higgs boson couldn't be seen because it would go back in time and stop itself from ever being produced by somehow stopping the accelerator. I considered after writing more for the blog post, but then after you told me that it was the most popular blog post ever, I figured I could only go downhill. So I decided to quit while I was ahead, because then, what else can I do but go down at that point?
Yeah, no pressure, but we are expecting a massive following for this edition of the podcast because of your sort of notoriety. I just figured you couldn't deal with the fame, and so you decided to kind of
right.
hunker down and concentrate on the physics again, rather than, talking about time-traveling Higgs bosons from the future and causing grandfather paradoxes and inspiring birds to drop bits of baguettes into the LHC. That was one of the things that shut it down at some point, wasn't it?
Right. Yes. Actually, that also did happen, where somebody or a bird or a parent, supposedly maybe a technician, I don't know, dropped a piece of a baguette, and unfortunately, it caused a temporary shutdown. There was also a case where one of the transformers that's on the surface, unfortunately for a small weasel-like animal called a fouine, which lives in France, decided that it would be a nice place to get warm and touched a transformer, and unfortunately it discharged through him to ground and took out him and that section of the power for the LHC for a while. So we've had a few interesting things that have occurred. Fortunately, so far, no humans were involved in any of those very unfortunate incidences, but one fouine down.
So since I haven't checked up on you since then, was the LHC forever shut down?
No. So it's been extremely successful. As you know, we discovered the Higgs boson about 10 years ago. In fact, there's going to be some celebration events around July this year, both at CERN and around the world for the 10th anniversary of its discovery. But it had remarkable success for the first run, and then it has been undergoing some upgrades, both in terms of the accelerator in order to increase what we call the luminosity or the brightness of the beams, so there'll be more collisions essentially, and also to improve the detector in order to deal with that and improve our ability to reconstruct and do physics with that. So, if you look at the long-term plan of the LHC, it plans to run for almost another 20 years, roughly through 2040 or so. And we've only taken a few percent of that data. So there's still a large amount of data to take and to analyze and hopefully to have other big discoveries.
You were part of one of the teams that discovered the Higgs boson, and there was huge fanfare around that. What is the LHC still searching for? What is there left to find at this point?
Right. So it's a great question. I think many people were surprised actually by how quickly we found the Higgs boson after it turned on. And it was only a couple of years after its inauguration that we were able to discover that particle. So the Higgs boson was never the most popular thing that people were hoping to find. There was a quote of my former colleague, Nobel Prize winner Shelley Glashow, who was instrumental in the basically construction of the standard model in the 60s and 70s. He had this famous quote in which he said, "The Higgs boson is like your house's toilet. Everyone agrees it plays an extremely important function, but it doesn't feature highly on house tours. It plays an extremely important role in particle physics and giving particles their mass. However, the fact of the matter is that in order to be consistent, there has to be a lot of what we call fine tuning in the universe. That is, that seemingly unrelated parameters have to cancel out to incredible precision, sometimes 17 decimal points or more. And it could just be that the universe is like that, that just so happens that from quantum corrections, the various masses of the particles and their couplings work out just so. However, in previous eras, this has pointed to that there was really some underlying dynamics, some underlying physics that we just hadn't really appreciated yet, we hadn't discovered yet, that made those relationships have to be true. And so there's been 20 to 30 to 40 years now of hypothesis over what that can be. So a famous one is supersymmetry, which is that there would be a factor of 2 more particles out there in the world. And this would have a lot of attractive features, such as canceling these fine-tuning corrections from other yet unseen particles, from unifying different forces. And there are many other theories that are also out there that try to explain how that could come about. Unfortunately, we haven't seen any evidence of them. And so there's that increasingly more tension with those theories as well. But the complete exploration of that space and being able to search all the way up to the multi-TeV scale for the existence of those particles, and also to make more precise measurements of the known particles in order to test our theories, continues to be the overall theme of the experiment.
I'm going to put links on the podcast page, fqxi.org/community/podcast, to more information about the LHC's third run, which involves looking for new particles that might serve as evidence for extensions to the standard model of particle physics, such as supersymmetry, as Kevin Black mentioned. You'll also find a link to FQXi's report on fine-tuning, which describes some of the tensions we were just chatting about. And of course, I'm going to link to Kevin's now infamous classic blog post about how the LHC was being sabotaged from the future by a time-travelling Higgs boson bent on preventing its own existence. There's a lot more to cover in particle physics news with Kevin, including the recent hints of a violation of the predictions of the standard model, as Fermilab scientists measure the W boson to be a bit heavier than it should be. And we'll be coming back to all of that in a short while. But first, the LHC isn't the only underground physics experiment in the news. FQXi physicist Catalina Curceanu at INFN in Italy and her colleagues have just published a paper in the journal Physics of Life Reviews talking about their tests of quantum theory. Their lab is housed deep under the Gran Sasso Mountains, where they are searching for signs of spontaneous radiation predicted by an alternative to standard quantum theory. According to standard quantum physics, before being observed, a particle can occupy multiple states simultaneously. It can be in two places at once, say. But when it is measured, it collapses to one set identity, being located in one place in this example. How this happens is a mystery, however. One group of theories, called collapse models, offers a tantalizing answer. Maybe a system is more likely to collapse, the idea goes, the bigger or heavier the system is. Some of these models suggest that when such a gravity-triggered collapse occurs, some radiation will be emitted. And that's what Curceanu and her colleagues are searching for. If she and her team find this radiation, it will not only be a boost for collapse models, but it will also be a boon for a controversial theory of consciousness proposed in the 1990s by Nobel laureate Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. Curceanu has been telling our reporter Brendan Foster all about her hunt for that radiation.
So is this connection between the inner world and the outer world in a kind of unique framework, which is really, really fascinating.
Catalina Curceanu is a physicist with a specialty in nuclear and quantum physics experiments. She is a staff scientist at INFN in Italy, where she leads a group of scientists, is spokesperson of Siddhartha II and VIP2 international collaborations, and now has been awarded a grant by FQXi to study consciousness and quantum mechanics. Consciousness has a slippery, circular meaning, something like being aware, aware of existing, aware of being conscious. For physicists who want to understand it, a big question is, how does consciousness connect to quantum mechanics, our theory of the very small, most basic particles and forces? The problem is, quantum mechanics has its own notoriously slippery features that seem to put it at odds with our everyday conscious experience of a single, definite, smooth reality. This slipperiness comes down to features of the wave function, the piece of the theory that lets us predict the chances of various results when we make a measurement. On the one hand, we have superpositions, a kind of simultaneous parallel reality where the theory seems to tell us the chances that a particle could be here or there or in both places or neither. And on the other hand, we have collapses. The theory tells us that when we measure where that particle is and we find that it is definitely here, not there, then the superposed wave function collapses to represent the one single reality we just observed. When we try to match all these features with our idea of consciousness, we have to deal with the fact that we don't seem to experience either superposed realities or that kind of jolt of an instant collapse in our everyday lives. Well, unless that's exactly what consciousness is.
Initially, I thought, like, oh, come on. But when I've seen that Roger is one of the proponents, I started to read it more carefully. Then I realized that it's at least to my knowledge, maybe the only real physical theory about consciousness in which I can do something.
In the 1990s, physicist Roger Penrose, together with anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, proposed that wave function collapse was a central part of consciousness. Their theory identified microstructures of the brain that might have the right size and shape to allow the growth of superpositions, which would then collapse under the influence of the brain's complexity. Now, this second piece, the collapse, depends on another unverified theory called collapse theory. This theory adds some extra details to basic quantum mechanics that explain why the wave function collapses, what kinds of settings might trigger a collapse. The key for Curceanu is that these extra details mean the theory makes a new prediction for the way particles move and the amount of radiation they might emit. A test of the collapse theory, then, would mean watching some matter looking for this extra radiation. And that's exactly the specialty of Curceanu's lab.
And this to me was really fascinating. I'm an experimental physicist, and I realized that with what I'm doing in my lab, I can do something which has an impact in a theory about consciousness. And this triggered kind of a wow, it's really amazing, it's fantastic. So it came together two things of which I'm mostly interested. One, it's quantum mechanics and basic foundational theory about the universe, so the outer world. And then you realize that the same type of thing can be connected with the inner world.
Curceanu's lab is located in a very quiet spot deep underground beneath the Gran Sasso mountain in Italy. There, highly sensitive detectors sit patiently around a simple crystal of germanium, watching for this spontaneous radiation. So far, results from the lab look like just what you expect from quantum mechanics without the extra collapse rules. But Curceanu says there is a lot of work to do to improve the sensitivity of the experiment and the data analysis methods.
Actually, we are now doing a new type of data taking. So the experiment is going on. We are improving our capacity to reach, to improve, so to enlarge the energy range, to further dump the background. Not only the experiment, but also the data analysis procedure. We are refining our skills, both in experiment, enlarging the energy range, and in analysis methods. And to do that, of course, we need to work in close contact with theoreticians.
Adjusting the theory's details on how the collapse could happen might mean predictions of smaller, harder-to-detect signals. Curceanu has two collaborators on the project who will focus on finding the right details for the collapse theory that match the experiments while giving a sensible explanation of quantum mechanics and consciousness. Loyos Diosi is a long-time expert on collapse theories, and Maneli Derkshani is a younger physicist with a background that touches on the philosophy of quantum mechanics. This means that the team will also ask, regardless of the experimental outcome, does it even make sense to try to describe consciousness this way? Curceanu feels inspired at this moment.
Usually people take for granted that quantum mechanics is valid everywhere and anywhere, and that's fine, because otherwise you couldn't do physics if you don't. But that's not necessarily true. And the fact that we are struggling for 100 years to try to understand the basic features or basic whys of the quantum mechanics might point out to something which is still to be uncovered. And this is by itself somehow extremely, extremely exciting to be part of this adventure. And I think that by this point of view, whatever the outcome it is, you will end up more enriched in your knowledge about the world. That's really a lot of fun, and it's very exciting to get involved in this type. So to get this kind of, I don't want to call it power, but this prolongation from what you can do in a lab of physics to try to make an adventure, an endeavor towards something which is so basic to all of us and so obvious that one can hardly really define it.
That was Catalina Curceanu talking with Brendan Foster. On the podcast page, I'll be linking to an in-depth article by Brendan on these experiments, and also efforts to connect quantum physics and consciousness by FQXi member Angelo Bassi of the University of Trieste in Italy. As for Curceanu, since recording that interview, her preliminary results are in and published in Physics of Life reviews. The early news isn't encouraging. The tests haven't found any evidence as yet. But those results don't close the door on Penrose and Hameroff's model, so there's still hope. I'm linking to our press release too, which explains more. Now, from tests of massive systems that could overturn standard quantum theory, to experiments with heavy W bosons that potentially break the standard model of particle physics. It's back to Kevin Black to find out the latest on a surprising announcement back in April from physicists at Fermilab in Batavia, Illinois. They say that precision tests of this elementary particle have produced some unexpected results. The W boson is just too hefty. So, Kevin, what is a W boson and why did it make front page headlines around the world?
Sure. So it was really exciting to see this result come out. The W boson is one of the particles that mediates the weak interaction. So it's responsible for radioactive decays. It turns out that there is a mathematical relationship between the mass of the W boson, the mass of the top quark, and the mass of the Higgs boson through what we call quantum or radiative corrections. That is to say that if you, for example, have a Higgs boson, which is out in the universe somewhere, it can temporarily have a loop correction, for example, to a top and an anti-top pair that can come out of the vacuum temporarily, and then they can annihilate and go back to a Higgs boson. And so it turns out that there should be a relationship in the standard model of particle physics between these different parameters. And since the time that I was actually doing my PhD research 20 years ago, there has been a little bit of tension between the predictions that you would have from the standard model and also what you see in data. But it was always at the order of just on the brink of being consistent and just, a little bit of a hint of maybe being possibly inconsistent. In particle physics, we tend to call these things sigma or standard deviations away from the expectation. And so this was what we would call, it's at the level of 1 to 2 sort of sigma disagreement when I was doing my research. 1 sigma would be completely consistent. 2 sigma is a little bit less consistent, but still a 5% chance that it's consistent with the theory. And so when this measurement came out, it was drastically different, up to 7 sigma difference between the prediction and the experiment. And so roughly speaking, that means that there's something like 1 in 300 billion chance that if this were consistent, you would get this result. And so that's incredibly unlikely. And so naively speaking, the W mass measurement being 7 sigma away from the theory is extremely exciting. You would think that this is basically saying that the standard model is not consistent. It's also something which I would say is a lot of people are also suspicious of because of the fact that it's such a large discrepancy with the standard model. And it also turns out to be not completely consistent with previous measurements of the W boson. There's a fair amount of tension between both the theory and previous experiments.
So yeah, I was just going to play you in a little snippet of an interview that I recorded with Nobel laureate Frank Wilczek, who recently won the Templeton Prize. And he's famed for having done work on the strong force of particle physics, the force that sort of binds subatomic particles within the atomic nucleus. And, while I had him on Zoom, I did ask him about the W boson mass result. And I'll play you in what he says here.
I am pretty skeptical of it, actually, just on technical grounds. I don't in any way want to denigrate the efforts of the people involved. If you look at the paper, it's a very impressive piece of work. They've considered all kinds of effects and things that might be wrong and calibrations and things like that. But it's an attempt to do a high precision measurement of the mass of an unstable particle that decays in very exotic ways and very, very fast. So it's hard for you to study it in detail. And then also because it does have a finite lifetime in quantum mechanics, that means there's a certain uncertainty in its mass. So even defining the mass is subtle. They've tried very hard, and they're intelligent people. They've gathered a lot of data, done a lot of work to try to get everything under control. But just the fact that it is so complicated sort of raises an eyebrow. And then even more serious, I think, is the fact that it not only is discrepant with theoretical calculations, but it's also discrepant with previous experimental measurements. So to me, at least, the jury is still out. This result needs to be looked at very, very critically. And so I'm not excited about it. I think it was Eddington who made a famous statement or notorious statement that you should never believe an experiment until it's confirmed by theory. I think that's going too far. But if there were an interesting theoretical hypothesis that suggested that there would be this kind of discrepancy in the W boson mass, but no other discrepancy with all the other tests, that would be fantastic. Oh, wow, we had an attractive hypothesis that's now been confirmed. But that's not the case, as far as I know. There's no attractive theoretical framework that predicts this particular pattern of discrepancy from the standard model. So that's another reason I'm not excited.
You mentioned that in your own answer there, that there's not only discrepancy with the standard model, but there's discrepancy with, other tests. So is that the general feeling amongst particle physicists, that it's still a bit of a watch and wait situation?
Yeah, I would say so. I think Frank there has it very correct that most people are hopeful, but I would say a little bit skeptical that this will stand the test of time. And so he highlights two sort of important things. One is that it's an extremely precise measurement. That is to say that it's claiming to have incredible precision and incredible level of detail that goes into it and involves various calibrations, various corrections to different effects, both experimental and also theoretical effects. And so, first of all, it's just a very difficult measurement to make at that level of precision. Anybody could go out with the LHC data or the Tevatron data and make a measurement that was valid to a couple GeV, right? But this is thousands and thousands of times more precise measurement, down to on order of 10 MeV or so. That means that's a factor of several thousand. And therefore, because of that precision, any small thing that goes wrong in the experiment could make a difference at that level. And as somebody looking from the outside, overall, when I saw the talks and I read the paper, it all looks reasonable, but it's very difficult, to know if there's a small problem somewhere, in the code, or a small problem in the calibration that occurred. Now, if you listen to, the process which they went through, it took them years and years. This is data that was taken over 10 years ago, and they spent many, many years, literally, checking all of these things in as much detail as they can. I'm confident that they did the best job that they can, and there's no obvious problems with it. But nonetheless, one is left with this overall sense of a little bit of uneasiness. And the second factor in my mind also is what to make of that discrepancy. So I think there are a couple of points there. One is that unlike a statistical uncertainty, like when you toss a coin and you see how often it lands on it, heads or tails, and you say it's extremely unlikely that you would get a long string of either heads or tails. And the more times you get heads in a row, the more you start to question if this is really a fair coin, or if it's highly weighted, or has both sides are actually heads, or something like that, right? But that process of understanding the statistics is a well understood mathematical problem. What is more difficult to understand is some of the theoretical uncertainties that go into this measurement. And that is to say that we can't measure everything, we can't predict everything with absolute certainty. Some things come from trying to extrapolate our uncertainty on understanding how the proton collisions work and what fraction of the energy a particular quark in the proton-antiproton collision energy it will have. There, it's much less clear that you can treat that as just a statistical only hypothesis, right? And so it could also be that everything is fine with the measurement. It's just our interpretation of it is wrong because we don't know how to interpret what it means to say that there is a theoretical uncertainty on how the proton-proton collision could occur. And finally, yes, the other point that Frank makes about different models is that I think there are many, many papers that were put out on the archive, hundreds of them, almost immediately when the WMASS result came out, trying to explain them. And some of them are, I would say, are more credible than others. However, there are very few of these models, I think there are a couple, which would honestly predict this from first principle, right?
I have one more slightly technical and possibly stupid question for you, Kevin. And that is, we're talking about trying to work out exactly what the mass of the W boson is. And you've been very involved with discovering the Higgs boson and its mass. How do particle physicists know that they have actually identified a certain particle if they don't know its properties, like its mass? And it could be, decades before they actually find out what its mass is. How do you know you've actually got that particle in the first place?
Yeah, so this is a good question. And it's a series of sort of inductive steps, I would say. For example, when we first discovered the Higgs boson 10 years ago, people were hesitant to actually call it the Higgs boson. People were calling it the Higgs-like particle or Higgs-like boson. It's for exactly that reason, that when you first see some anomalous signature in your detector that can't be explained by any other known particles, you start asking some basic questions. What is the mass of this particle? What is its spin? And you can work that out by looking at the angular distribution of its decays. And so different pieces of that puzzle start to come together. And then you start looking at its branching ratios. What does the particle decay into? So it turns out that the thing that we saw in 2012, we just call it the Higgs boson now, the standard model Higgs, because it looks exactly like, the standard model Higgs boson. In the very beginning, it was not clear. In this case, we were, somewhat lucky in the fact that we had a theory which made very precise predictions. It's a whole nother story if it's a new particle entirely that you weren't expecting, right? Because then you don't even know how to design your analysis or design your experiment because you're just looking for some anomalous signature. And so it's been a while, right, since the particle physicists have been in the state where they actually discovered something new. And so you have to go back, I think, to the 60s and 70s and 50s where they were discovering all of the QCD resonances, which are now well known, and also the new heavy particles of the charm and the tau, where they were not expecting them. And it took quite some time, right, to actually understand exactly what they were. For some time, for example, in the 50s and 60s, when they were discovering a bunch of new particles, that's kind of the dream of experimental particle physicists like me, is to get back to that era where we have that problem of having so many things that we don't know what to make of them.
So all the news stories and the coverage, and you yourself have sort of talked about how finding a discrepancy with a standard model would be exciting, and it's something that people are hopeful about. You're not saying it's, a devastating possibility and your whole career will go down the toilet because, the standard model of particle physics is wrong. If you could just explain to us, why are physicists okay about the standard model being wrong? If it's, this brilliant theory that explains so much, why are people actually looking forward to finding a discrepancy?
Right. I think one of the key things to understand is that in science, usually you learn the most when you do an experiment and you find something that you didn't expect. And sort of the ultimate goal, basically, of particle physics is to find more and more simple explanations of fundamental interactions and find new particles and new interactions so that we can understand. It could be perfectly well that the standard model is correct, but it's a very complicated theory that was put together over a 20-year time period that involves three different forces: the electromagnetic forces, the weak forces, and the strong interactions that we've talked about. And in particular, it doesn't say anything about gravity, which is assumed to be so weak on the scale of elementary particle physics that it doesn't come into the picture. And so I think at the heart, particle physicists would really like to be able to come to sort of one theory that incorporated all of these different aspects: the weak interaction, the strong interaction, electricity, magnetism, and even gravity. And hopefully that theory is even simpler than the one that we have now.
I should say it's also not just physicists liking to have sort of better theories that just seem simpler. There are also a couple of things that the standard model can't explain, not just bringing in gravity, but also the identity of dark matter. So I'm going to put a link to that interview that I did with Frank Wilczek on the podcast page, fqxi.org/community/podcast, where he talks a little bit about his own ideas about what dark matter might be. He sort of invented his own little particle that could explain it. And he talks a bit about experimental efforts to try and find that.
When you talk about dark matter, this is one of the things where there's many different routes to this, and people all over the world are trying in colliders and trying in direct dark matter detection experiments and trying in experiments in space looking for indirect detection of it. And you have to keep on trying for different methodologies, looking for different types of decays or different types of interactions. And then hopefully at some point we will be able to put together a coherent story of what it all means.
We'll be coming back to Kevin Black a little bit later in the edition to find out what it felt like 10 years ago to be in the midst of a Nobel Prize-winning discovery. But now it's time for, time. If you listened to our March edition, you would have heard Kate Becker talking about the puzzle of what time means at the quantum level, where everything gets a little bit fuzzy. If you want to measure time on that scale, then you need something that's quite tricky to build: a quantum clock. In a special piece created by Pronk Productions, quantum physicists Arkady Fedorov, Prasanna Pakim, and Eric He take us into their lab at the University of Queensland in Australia.
Clocks are very important devices. So fundamentally, this is a device which allows us to keep track of time. And therefore, it is very important to understand the limitations of our timekeeping. My name is Arkady Fedorov, and I'm an experimental quantum physicist. In a clock has to tick, right? So if the system, our clock, classical clock, is in thermal equilibrium, I think that we will not be able to count time because nothing would be clicking. It would be just in the lowest energy state, right? And so, like, for example, pendulum, just a pendulum is not a clock, right? Because pendulum would be like swinging back and forth, and then eventually it would just stop at the bottom. So if you supply, like in a quartz clock, for example, it's a battery, and a pendulum, it's a spring, compressed spring, and some nonlinear mechanism, so that we kick, with every swing, we kick a little bit of energy into the pendulum, which exactly compensate the energy which is lost while the pendulum swings. So then we can keep our clock ticking all the time. So we would like to investigate this type of questions in a kind of a limiting regime, where our clock is quantum, and therefore quantum mechanics put some limits on our timekeeping. And I guess generally we would like to actually identify those limits and see how our clock will behave in the regime of quantum mechanics.
I'm Prasanna Pakim, and I'm working as a postdoctoral research fellow as basically a physicist, but my background is also in engineering, so a lot of my skill sets in that also get used in my day-to-day work. The laboratory that we typically work in involves, in the center of it is the so-called dilution fridge, which effectively supercools our experiments down to a very, very cold temperature. And one of the initial stages that you try to get your temperature down to is 4 Kelvin. So that's 4 degrees above absolute zero. With a dry dilution fridge, which is what we're working in, we have these things called pulse tube cryocoolers. And their operation is very similar to how a fridge, like, your normal bar fridge or your house fridge would work. The only issue here is that here you can really hear the compressor that's moving the gases around in order to get it cooled down to that 4 Kelvin stage, and you can actually hear it. It's something that it sounds something similar to like at a very periodic manner, and it's actually very annoying when you first enter the room. But I guess as you keep working there, your brain automatically just performs noise cancellation to a point where actually when we open the fridge, so therefore turning off the cryocoolers, it actually is a very eerie silence.
A child walks, humming, home down a winter street. This child is 10 years old, returning from school, where their day is full of friends and laughter, free from worries of what tomorrow's day will bring. And so they hum and smile. The child walks the street as they have many times before, but there is something different by the roadside here. A sparkle on the edge of sight and thought that tugs the child's attention and silences their humming. There, by the side of the road, an adult's wristwatch lying in the dirt. The child picks it up. They've never held a watch before. It is a little damp and cold. Its hands look still. The child holds the watch up to their ear. No sound. No sound. And then, after an aching age, as if awaking from an ancient slumber, comes a sonorous, reverberant tick. The whole world seems to mark it. The whole world holds its breath. Tick. A second. Tick.
Yeah, my name is Eric He. I'm a postdoc research fellow at the University of Queensland. The title of the project is Measurement-Driven Quantum Clock. So the take-home message for pendulum clock is that you have to do work to make it tick. Well, here is that we're trying to use measurements to drive a qubit. I'm not sure you are familiar with qubit or not. Qubit basically is the same as a transistor in our CPU. Our CPU can have 0 and 1 states. Quantum bits can be collapsed to 0 and 1 states. But like a Schrödinger's cat, it can be a superposition of 0 and 1. The qubit is basically the pendulum. So, but instead of doing work to drive the pendulum, what we're doing is that we are measuring the information of the pendulum by observing the states of the pendulum. The pendulum can oscillate without a battery. So we are making a clock by driving the qubits between 0 and 1, but the drive method is not doing work to the qubits. It's not plug a battery to the qubit. We're doing measurements to measure the information of the qubits to drive the qubits to generate a signal.
And I think that this is kind of like the key point of this experiment. So that in order to be able to count time, we need to some ticks in our signal. And these ticks only appear if you measure the system fundamentally. Because otherwise, it would be just in a steady state. It would be just like a pendulum in the, let's say, pointing down. So that's why, in some sense, we kind of realize the concept that actually our quantum clock is in fact it's fueled by information, because it's fueled by the process where we extract information, not by information, by extracting information from it.
It's very bizarre that to general public that a measurement can drive a clock or drive a machine. I think probably the uncertainty principle is quite common to people. Is that when you know precision very well, at this moment the momentum of the object is very large. But as time goes by, when the system evolves, the state of the object evolves. When you have a large momentum at this moment, then which means that at the next time step, the large uncertainty in momentum will be evolved back into x in the position, which means that at the next step, your object will have very large uncertainty in position, which means you have a very large position amplitude. So this is basically the similar idea as what we're using measurement to drive a qubit. Basically, the flow of the information out of the qubits drives the qubit to oscillate.
Questions we're probing are effectively just fundamental questions regarding the nature of time and space itself. One of the things that you would actually look into in general relativity is that it tells us that the nature of time is actually very much only defined by coincidences. So if I have a timekeeper that tells me tick, 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 then I use that as my reference and say okay, now I can keep time and measure all these events with respect to a time. And that has some interesting implications. For example, if I just have a universe of just a couple of particles, say 2 particles in it, then the notion of time cannot actually work, because there aren't many events to form the coincidences. And in fact, right now, the state of physics believes that the emergence of time is probably from entropy-based origins. And the thing with entropy is that you only really have a good definition of it especially when there's a large number of particles, especially the thermodynamic definition of entropy. So the question that we come back to is basically, given a system, what is the minimum resource that we require in order to be able to time keep? And this experiment it demonstrates in a particular way where the resources that we have is basically a qubit, but that is being measured continuously. So in this case, the generation of entropy comes from the fact that we are applying measurements using our electronics from the outside.
An adult lies in bed beside the wristwatch, awake in another unwelcome midnight. Days flow fast, work and family and money and tick and tick. The moon spins through the sky above. The adult lies in the bed. The wristwatch speaks to the bedroom at large, or just to you.
Thank you to Arkady Fedorov, Prasanna Pakim, and Eric He. That was a special piece created for us by Prunk Productions. Jack Monahan wrote and narrated the story, and music and sound design were by Robert Moutry. We ran another of their immersive pieces back in December 2021, and it had a great response. So if you haven't heard that yet, I will add a link to it on the podcast page, fqxi.org/community/podcast. It's called The Hiding Place in the Universe, and I encourage you to check that out. I'm also adding links to an article about the quantum clockmaking effort in Queensland by reporter Nicola Jones, and to FQXi's in-depth report on time by Kate Becker, produced in partnership with the John Templeton Foundation. The Queensland team there are trying to invent a new device to measure time on the quantum scale, a regime that hasn't been explored in this way before. Kevin Black, you're still with us, and you know something about engineering new experiments to probe uncharted territory. Let's just go back a little over a decade to the Higgs discovery. It involved massive experiments by two independent experimental teams, Atlas and CMS, and you were then part of Atlas. Both teams were working separately using totally different setups and came up with the same results. Those were years in the making, and I imagine that before any announcements were made, there were many rounds of checking the data. What did it feel like to be part of that at that time, knowing that maybe, in all likelihood, you had seen something really big, but having to keep it secret and waiting to see whether it would be confirmed before going public?
Yeah, I think it's extremely exciting. And that was I think the highlight of my career professionally was that period of time where we were all analyzing the data, being very critical of each other, doing the different analysis, trying to make sure that we were doing all the cross checks. Because we knew that because it was such a big deal, and also because it was going to make the press, there's going to be a lot of eyes on us once we made it public. From that point of view, I think there was a lot of worrying that somehow we had made some type of mistake, right? From an outside point of view, when someone else makes a mistake, I think people are generally fairly forgiving and they understand, that could have happened to them. But when you're the person who made it, you feel pretty bad, right? At the time. There was a lot of excitement. The thing that I remember the most actually was that even internally they kept the exact information. They didn't make it even public, even available to all of the collaboration members until they were really sure they were going to go out with that. And that was trying to reduce bias and looking at the data. So I was involved in looking at and reviewing the analysis for Atlas in one particular decay channel. I wasn't actually allowed to see it in the other decay channels until the end, until we said, okay, we were okay with this particular sub-analysis. And the reason is because if you know the answer, right, what you're supposed to get, it's very hard to maintain a completely unbiased opinion one way or the other. And I think that is what sped up the acceptance of the result as well, is that it wasn't just one analysis that saw this anomalous thing. It was a series of at least 3, depending on how you count, maybe 6 different analyses in each experiment, and also between completely different sets of people in 2 different experiments. And they all pointed at the same thing. And that gave you a lot of confidence that this thing was real. Since that time, we've had a lot of anomalies that have come and go, but there are very few of them that have really stood the test of time. There are some interesting ones that have been growing over time, and we're taking a look at, and hopefully when we start up for our next run at the LHC, we'll be able to see if those really stay there.
I feel we've subtly got back to the W Boson mass without you actually saying that out loud. But I was going to say, thank you very much, Kevin Black. You've described how exciting it is to have been part of a groundbreaking experiment discovering the Higgs. We've touched on the possibility that the W Boson mass experiment is, a groundbreaking, earth-shattering experiment that's going to, destroy the standard model, or at least require it to be modified a little bit. But I'm just thinking, little did you know, these would all kind of pale in comparison to the exciting blog post that you wrote about the LHC getting shut down by like a time-traveling pigeon with a baguette.
Right. Yes. Well, science fiction sometimes makes a better story than than science. So yeah, that's true.
Thank you to Kevin Black there. That's all we have time for. So our gratitude also goes to Frank Wilczek, Catalina Curceanu and Brendan Foster, Arkady Fedorov, Prasanna Pakim and Eric He, and Jack Monahan and Robert Moutry from Pronk Productions. As ever, more details about everything you have heard can be found on the podcast page, fqxi.org/community/podcast. You can also subscribe to the podcast directly on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And you can catch it on FQXi's YouTube channel, along with lots of great talks from our past conferences, including some content by Catalina Curceanu. If you want to contact us, you can do so by email at podcast@fqxi.org or on Twitter, where you'll find us at FQXi. We're at FQXi Physics on Facebook, Instagram and Pinterest, and on LinkedIn, we're FQXi. Phew. Thank you for listening. I've been Zeeya Merali. I'm off to celebrate the Higgsversary. Let's hope my quantum clock isn't running late.